the squeal of new hydraulic lines, and the deep, confident rumble of a brand-new six-cylinder diesel engine cut through the humid July air of 1974. It was a sound that didn't belong on this quiet gravel road, a sound of money and ambition. Frank Miller sat high in the climate-controlled cab of his John Deere 4630, the green paint so glossy it looked wet, the tires still showing the little rubber nubs from the factory. He'd parked it right at the fence line, separating his property from mine, a deliberate act of peacocking if I ever saw one. I was on my side of the fence, wrestling with the three-point hitch on my own John Deere, a 1968 model 4020. My tractor wasn't a museum piece, not by a long shot. It was a worker. The green paint on the hood was faded to a soft, chalky lime by a decade of Iowa sun. The fenders were scarred with the memories of tight turns and rogue fence posts. A spiderweb of cracks ran across the original seat cushion, patched with silver duct tape that burned your legs on a hot day. But it was mine. Every bolt, every grease zerk, every last drop of diesel in the tank was paid for. Frank killed the engine on his new machine, and the sudden silence was almost as loud as the noise had been. The cab door opened with a gentle hiss, a sound of modern engineering I wasn't used to. He swung himself down, his new work boots barely dusty. He was a big man, running to fat in his middle years, with a face that was always a little too red, a little too eager. "Afternoon, Art," he boomed, hooking his thumbs in the straps of his brand-new overalls. He gestured with his chin toward my 4020. "Still fighting with that old girl?" I gave the lift arm a final shove, and it seated with a solid clank. I wiped a line of sweat and grease from my forehead with the back of my forearm. "She ain't fighting me, Frank. We're just having a discussion about the proper way to hook up a disc bine." Frank chuckled, a sound that never quite reached his eyes. "A discussion, huh? Well, me and this baby," he patted the massive rear tire of the 4630, "we don't have discussions. She just does what I tell her. 150 horsepower at the drawbar, Art. Air conditioning, a radio. I swear it's more comfortable than my living room." I grunted, grabbing a wrench from my toolbox. I didn't need to hear the sales pitch. I'd heard it from the dealer, from the banker, from half the men at the co-op. This was the era of get big or get out. Farming was changing. It wasn't about thrift and patience anymore. It was about leverage, credit, and horsepower. "She's a fine-looking machine, Frank. Congratulations," I said. And I meant it. I didn't begrudge a man his success. I just questioned his definition of it. "Fine-looking?" "Art, she's the future," he said, his voice dropping into a confidential, preachy tone. The bank was practically begging me to take the loan. Land values are going through the roof. Corn's over $3 a bushel. A man would be a fool not to expand right now. A damn fool. He looked me square in the eye, letting the implication hang in the air between us. I was that fool. I was still farming the same 240 acres my father had farmed, the same land my grandfather broke with a team of mules. Frank, in the last 3 years, had doubled his operation to over 1,000 acres, all of it on borrowed money. "I talked to Henderson down at the bank," he went on. "Told him you ought to come in. He'd set you up right. Trade in that old 4020. Get yourself a new machine. Hell, get 2. You could pick up that 80 acres south of you that old man Hemlock is looking to sell. Farm fence row to fence row." I tightened a nut on the PTO shield, the steel groaning in protest. "The 4020 runs good, Frank. And this farm is enough for me and Helen." Frank threw his hands up in exasperation. "Enough? What's enough? There's no such thing as enough anymore, Art. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're trying to dig it out with a teaspoon. That old tractor, it's costing you money every day. It's slow. It breaks down. You're wasting time you could be using to farm more ground." "It's paid for," I said quietly, looking up from my work. "The land's paid for too. When I turn the key in the morning, the only man I have to answer to is myself. The only interest I'm paying is in the weather and the price of corn." Frank shook his head, a pitying smile on his face. "That's old-time thinking, Art. Sentimental. You can't run a business on sentiment. This isn't Granddad's farm anymore. It's an enterprise. You gotta have a line of credit. You gotta have cash flow. You gotta depreciate your assets." He rattled off the buzzwords he'd learned from the farm magazines and the young banker with the fancy suit. He saw the look on my face, the stubborn set of my jaw, and his tone softened, turning into one of fake concern. "Look, I'm just trying to help you. I don't want to see you get left behind. In 5 years, guys like you, with your old iron and your little patches of ground, you're going to be extinct. The big operations will swallow you whole. Henderson at the bank said so himself." I stood up straight, wiping my greasy hands on a red rag. I was leaner than Frank, hardened by the work, not insulated from it. "Well, you tell Henderson I appreciate the concern," I said, my voice level. "But my father taught me 2 things. First, never trust a man who profits from your debt. Second, if you can't fix it yourself, you can't afford to own it." This 4020. I slapped its faded green hood, the metal warm from the sun. "I know every bolt and every wire on her. I can rebuild her engine in my own shop with a set of wrenches and a manual. Can you do that with that new computerized spaceship of yours, Frank?" He sputtered, his face getting redder. "I don't have to. It's under warranty. If something breaks, I call the dealer, and they send a man out in a truck. That's progress, Art." "Is it?" I asked. "Or is it just another chain, another man you owe, another payment you have to make, rain or shine, good prices or bad?" We stood there for a long moment, the fence between us seeming wider than just a few feet of wire. It was a canyon between 2 different worlds, 2 different beliefs. He saw me as a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone era, too stubborn and too scared to embrace the future. I saw him as a gambler, betting the farm his family had worked for a century on the promise of easy money and the hum of a new machine. He believed in the bank. I believed in my own 2 hands. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like me, a man who stuck to his guns and his old ways when the whole world, his friends, his neighbors, the so-called experts, were all telling him he was a fool? Let me know down in the comments, because I need to know that men like that weren't just a dream. Because for a long time, standing on my side of that fence, I felt awfully alone. The summer of '74 bled into fall, and the differences between my operation and Frank's became the talk of the township. Frank's new 4630, pulling a massive 20-foot disc, could work down his corn ground in a single afternoon. I was out there for 2 days with my 4020 and my 12-foot IHC disc, making the same slow, methodical passes my father had made before me. Frank hired a custom combining crew with 2 brand-new Gleaner N6 combines that chewed through his 1,000 acres in a week. I spent 3 weeks on my old Massey Ferguson 510, stopping every few hours to grease a fitting, adjust a belt, or clear a clog. The men at the grain elevator would watch us both come in. Frank would roll across the scales in a brand-new tandem axle grain truck, a hired man at the wheel. He'd dump 500 bushels and be gone in 15 minutes. I'd pull up in my 1965 Chevy C60, its straight 6 engine groaning under the weight of 250 bushels, the cab smelling of old vinyl and spilled coffee. They'd look at my truck, then look at me, and shake their heads. "Tough year, Art?" they'd ask, as if my smaller loads were a sign of failure, not just a different scale of operation. They didn't see that my 250 bushels were all mine. Frank's 500 bushels were already spoken for, sliced and diced between the bank, the fuel supplier, and the equipment dealer before the check was even printed. That winter, the inevitable happened. I was out clearing the lane after a heavy snow, the 40-tonne chugging along faithfully with the blade on the front, when I felt a lurch, a sudden loss of power to the rear wheels. I pushed in the clutch, and the tractor rolled to a stop, the engine still running smooth as ever. But when I let the clutch out, there was nothing but a faint, grinding sound from somewhere deep inside its iron guts. The differential. The ring and pinion gears had likely given up the ghost after thousands of hours of hard work. It was 10 degrees below zero, with the wind howling out of the northwest. A miserable day for a breakdown. I walked the half-mile back to the house, the cold biting at my face. Helen saw me coming from the kitchen window and had a hot cup of coffee ready when I stomped the snow off my boots on the porch. "What happened?" she asked, her face etched with worry. "Differential went out on the 40-20, I said, wrapping my frozen hands around the warm mug. "She's dead in the lane." "Oh, Art, can you fix it?" "I can fix it," I said, more to reassure her than myself. "It's just going to be a hell of a job, in this cold." The next morning, Frank Miller drove by in his brand new Ford pickup. He slowed down and rolled his electric window down with a soft whir. He saw my predicament, the 40-20 sitting cold and dead, and me setting up chain hoists on the big oak tree next to the lane. "Trouble?" he called out, a smug look on his face. "Differential," I grunted, not looking up from my work. "Told you that old junk would let you down," he said, unable to resist the jab. "Why don't you just call the scrap man? I'll co-sign a loan for you down at the bank. We can have a new one delivered by tomorrow afternoon." "I'm not scrapping her, Frank, and I'm not getting a loan," I said through clenched teeth. "Suit yourself," he shrugged, and the power window hummed shut. He drove off, leaving me alone in the biting wind. For the next 2 weeks, my farm shop became my world. It wasn't a fancy place, just a converted corn crib with a concrete floor I'd poured myself, a potbelly stove in the corner for heat, and a lifetime's collection of tools hanging on the walls. I used my little Ford 8N tractor to drag the crippled 40-20 into the shop. The job was a monster. I had to split the tractor in half, right behind the transmission housing. I built a stand out of railroad ties to support the front half, while I used the chain hoist to roll the rear half away. The air in the shop grew thick with the smell of gear oil, a smell so heavy and distinct it sticks in your memory forever. It took me a full day just to get the housing open. Bolt after bolt, crusted with dirt and rust, fought me every turn of the wrench. My knuckles were raw and bleeding. My muscles screamed in protest. Finally, the heavy cast iron case came free, and I saw the carnage. Just as I suspected, 3 teeth on the pinion gear had sheared clean off, and the ring gear was chewed up beyond repair. Sourcing the parts was the next challenge. The John Deere dealer wanted a fortune for a new set, money I didn't want to spend. So I spent 2 days on the phone, calling every tractor salvage yard in a 3-state radius. Finally, I found a place up in Wisconsin that had a 40-20 that had been wrecked in a fire. The rear end, they said, was untouched. I drove the 6 hours up there in my old pickup, the heater barely keeping up with the cold. I spent an afternoon in their frozen, muddy yard, pulling the parts myself with a set of greasy tools they loaned me. I paid the man in cash, a fraction of what the dealer wanted, and drove home, the heavy gears sitting in the bed of the truck like treasure. The reassembly was even harder than the teardown. Aligning the massive gears, setting the bearing preload, checking the backlash with a dial indicator. It was painstaking work. There were moments of sheer frustration when a bolt wouldn't line up or a seal wouldn't seat properly, when I wanted to throw a wrench through the wall. In those moments, I'd think of Frank Miller in his warm house, thinking about his next big purchase, and the anger would fuel me. This was the price of freedom, I told myself. Sore muscles and greasy fingernails were the currency of a debt-free life. After 2 solid weeks of 16-hour days, it was done. I bolted the tractor back together, filled the housing with fresh oil, and bled the hydraulic lines. With Helen watching nervously from the shop door, I climbed onto the seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The diesel engine coughed to life, bellowing a cloud of white smoke into the cold winter air before settling into its familiar, rhythmic idle. I eased the clutch out, shifted into gear, and the tractor moved forward, smooth and strong. A wave of relief and pride washed over me that was more satisfying than any new tractor smell Frank could ever describe. I had faced disaster, and I had won. With my own 2 hands. I hadn't called a dealer. I hadn't signed a loan paper. I had fixed it. The dawn of the late 1970s arrived like a fever dream for farmers in the Midwest. The grain embargoes and the massive sales to the Soviet Union sent crop prices into the stratosphere. Corn hit $3.50, then $4 a bushel. Soybeans were trading at prices that would have seemed like a fantasy just a few years earlier. At the same time, inflation was running wild across the country, and the conventional wisdom, preached from the pages of Farm Journal to the loan officers at the Farmers' Trust and Savings, was that the best way to beat inflation was to borrow. Debt was cheap, they said. Land was the ultimate hedge. They ain't making any more of it, was the mantra repeated at every sale, barn, and coffee shop. For Frank Miller, this was his vindication. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a tycoon of the soil. The high grain prices serviced his massive debt load with ease. With land values climbing 20% a year, his net worth on paper was exploding. He was a genius. He bought the 80 acres from Old Man Hemlock that sat between our farms. Then he bought another quarter section to the north. He traded in the 4630, which was barely 3 years old, for a brand new John Deere 8640, a massive 4-wheel drive articulated beast that looked like it belonged on a battlefield. It cost more than my entire farm was worth. He built a new harvestor silo, a tall blue monument to his success that towered over the landscape. He and his wife took a vacation to Hawaii, something unheard of for a working farmer. His success made my own quiet, disciplined approach look like foolishness. While Frank was buying land, I was using my profits from the good years to pay off the last of the mortgage my father had taken out 30 years prior. I walked into the bank and handed Mr. Henderson a final check. He stamped the papers with a look of mild confusion, as if he couldn't comprehend someone actually paying a loan off instead of refinancing it for a larger amount. "Well, Arthur," he said, shaking my hand limply. "Congratulations. You're one of the few." It didn't sound like a compliment. Instead of a new tractor, I bought a used but solid International 915 combine, paying cash. It was a bigger machine than my old Massey, and it cut my harvest time by a week. Instead of a new silo, I built an extension on my machine shed so I could keep all my equipment inside, out of the weather. I bought a heavy-duty welder and a lathe for the shop, investing in my ability to be self-sufficient. To everyone else, it looked like I was tinkering while Rome was being built next door. The talk at the diner was merciless. "Art Jensen's sitting on a gold mine and won't buy a new shovel. Heard he paid off his farm. Can you believe it? could have used that equity to buy up half the county. His wife must be a saint, watching the Millers live like kings while they're patching their overalls. Frank himself became almost unbearable. He'd stop by, leaning against his shiny truck, and give me unsolicited advice. "Art, it's not too late. You could still get in on this. Prices are only going one way, up. You're being too conservative. You gotta take risks to get rewards." "I'm happy with my rewards, Frank," I'd tell him, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "I sleep soundly at night." "You can sleep when you're dead," he'd laugh. "Now's the time to build an empire." One evening in the fall of '79, Helen and I were sitting on the porch swing, watching the sun set behind the oak trees. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of harvested fields. On the horizon, we could see the yard lights of the Miller farm, and a new one, brighter than the rest, from the new parcel of land he'd just bought. It felt like his territory was creeping closer, surrounding our small island of solvency. On the kitchen radio, a news announcer was talking. His voice was grim, a stark contrast to the peaceful evening. He was talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He spoke of combating inflation and monetary discipline. And then he said the words that sent a cold chill down my spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He spoke of raising the federal funds rate. Interest rates, he warned, were about to climb dramatically. Helen must have heard the change in the announcer's tone. "What is it, Art?" I didn't answer right away. I was listening to the rumble of Frank's new 8640, working late into the night on his newly acquired land, the lights of the massive machine carving up the darkness. He was running flat out, bigger and faster than ever before. But all I could hear was the sound of a man running toward the edge of a cliff, his eyes fixed on the horizon, completely unaware of the ground crumbling beneath his feet. "It's nothing," I said, putting my arm around her. "Just the weather changing." But I knew it wasn't true. The storm wasn't in the sky. It was coming from a long way off, from Washington, D.C., and I had a terrible feeling that when it finally broke, it was going to wash away a lot of men who had forgotten how to build an ark. The change, when it came, wasn't a sudden thunderclap, but a slow, sickening squeeze. The winter of 1980 started it. President Carter, in a fit of anger over the invasion of Afghanistan, slapped a grain embargo on the Soviet Union. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The price of corn at the elevator, which had been flirting with $4, fell through the floor. It dropped to $3, then $2.50. The men at the co-op stopped talking about expansion and started muttering about break-even points. Then came the summer. A brutal, brassy sun parked itself over Iowa in June and refused to leave. The rain simply stopped. By mid-July, the corn in the fields looked tortured. The leaves, which should have been broad, green, and reaching for the sky, were curled tight as cigars, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The tassels emerged weak and pale. Walking through my fields, the ground was cracked and hard as pavement. The air was so dry it felt like you were breathing dust. I did what I could. I cultivated my rows with the 40-20, trying to break up the cap on the soil and preserve what little moisture was left underneath. The old tractor didn't seem to mind the heat. It chugged along, its simple diesel engine running at a steady 180 degrees, just as it always did. My costs were minimal. I had my own seed from the year before, and my fuel bill, while not small, was manageable. I knew the crop would be short, but I also knew I would survive. I had no debt payments breathing down my neck. For Frank Miller, the drought and the price collapse were a two-fisted punch to the gut. He was farming over 1,000 acres of thirsty corn, and his input costs were staggering. The fertilizer bill alone for that much ground was more than my entire farm's operating budget for a year. I'd see his massive 8640 articulated tractor running at all hours, pulling a 24-row planter or a 50-foot field cultivator, burning diesel at a rate I could hardly imagine. The machine was a marvel of technology, but it was a thirsty, expensive beast. One blistering afternoon in August, I saw the beast die. I was mending a fence along the road when the John Deere service truck, a familiar sight in the county, pulled into Frank's lane. I watched as the mechanic, a young kid in a clean green uniform, climbed into the cab of the 8640 with Frank. They sat there for an hour, the engine silent. Then the kid came out, shaking his head, and drove away. Later that evening, I saw Frank myself, walking out to the machine with a toolbox. He was a man who had bragged he never had to turn a wrench, and it showed. He looked lost, overwhelmed. I ambled over, carrying a jug of iced tea Helen had made. "Trouble, Frank?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He threw a wrench onto the ground in frustration. It clanged against the huge steel drawbar. "Damn thing won't move," he spat. "Transmission. The kid from the dealer says it's the electronic shift controller, a circuit board or something. Has to order the part from Molin. Could be a week. A week! And he says the part alone is $2,000, not counting his labor to come back and put it in." I looked at the silent giant. Wires and hydraulic hoses snaked everywhere, disappearing into sealed black boxes. There were no simple linkages to adjust, no gears you could get at by pulling a cover plate. It was a machine built to be serviced, not fixed. "That's a tough break," I said, offering him the jug. He took it and drank deeply, the sweat rolling down his red face. "Tough break?" he said, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and fear. "Art, I've got a payment on this thing due next month that's more than you make in a year. I've got the note on the Hemlock place coming due. The bank's already called me twice this week about my operating loan. Henderson doesn't sound so friendly anymore. He keeps talking about variable rates and market adjustments. I need to get this corn harvested and sold, even at these miserable prices. I can't afford a week." He looked past me, at my little farmstead, the neat white house, and the sturdy red barn. He looked at my 4020, parked in the shed, covered in a respectable layer of dust, but ready to go. For the first time, I didn't see pity or smugness in his eyes. I saw a flicker of something else. Envy. "You were right, Art," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You were right. I'm chained to this thing. I'm chained to the bank, to the dealer, to the goddamn price of oil in Saudi Arabia. I built a house of cards, and the wind is starting to blow." He sank down onto the massive tire, his head in his hands. The silence of the broken machine seemed to echo the silence of his broken confidence. The first cracks in the empire weren't in the steel or the circuit boards. They were in the man himself. The wind Frank felt turned into a hurricane. By 1981, Paul Volcker's war on inflation had driven the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21%. For farmers like Frank, who lived on variable rate operating loans, it was a death sentence. The friendly letters from Mr. Henderson at the bank turned into cold legal notices. The payments on his land and equipment didn't just increase, they exploded, doubling and then tripling. At the same time, the asset that was supposed to be his ultimate security, the land, betrayed him. The speculative bubble burst. Farmland that had been selling for $4,000 an acre in 1979 was now struggling to fetch $2,000. Frank's equity, the paper wealth he had been so proud of, evaporated into thin air. He was suddenly upside down, owing far more on the land than it was worth. The bank, which had once seen him as a progressive, high-flying client, now saw him as a liability, a bad risk on their books. The stress etched itself onto his face, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth. The confident boom in his voice was replaced by a strained, worried rasp. His wife stopped going into town. The new pickup truck was the first thing to go, replaced by a beat-up old Ford with a rusty bed. Then the custom combining crew didn't show up that fall. Frank was out there himself, trying to keep his own aging combine running, a machine he'd neglected in favor of his new tractors. My life, by contrast, was an island of eerie calm in the middle of the storm. My crop yields were down from the lingering dry weather, and prices were still poor. Money was tight, no question. Helen and I put off buying a new couch and made the old one do another year. We ate more from our garden and less from the grocery store, but the fundamentals of our life were unshaken. The land was ours. The house was ours. The machinery in the shed was ours. No banker could take them away. When the property tax bill came, I wrote a check and mailed it. When the fuel supplier delivered diesel, I paid him on the spot. I was running a farm, not a leveraged financial portfolio. The final, inevitable blow for Frank came in the spring of 1983. A notice appeared in the legal section of the county newspaper, a small block of text that felt as final as an obituary. It announced a sheriff's sale. All property, real and personal, belonging to Frank and Carol Miller, was to be auctioned off on the courthouse steps to satisfy debts owed to the Farmers' Trust and Savings Bank. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a miserable March day that matched the mood. Half the county was there, it seemed. Some were bargain hunters, vultures circling a dying animal. Some were other farmers, their faces grim, knowing that it could just as easily be them. And some were just there to watch the spectacle, the final, public humiliation of a man who had flown too high. Frank and his wife stood by their car, looking like ghosts at their own funeral. He had lost a shocking amount of weight, his new overalls hanging loosely on his diminished frame. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with no room for sentiment, started with the machinery. The big 8640, the symbol of Frank's ambition, was the first to go. It looked magnificent, its green paint still bright. But everyone knew the debt attached to it, the cost of keeping it running. The bidding was sluggish, anemic. A big corporate farm from the next state bought it for less than half of what Frank had paid. I watched them drive it away, and it felt like they were hauling off a piece of Frank's soul. One by one, his possessions were sold off for pennies on the dollar. The harvestor silo, the grain trucks, the planters and discs, a lifetime of work, liquidated in under 2 hours. I stayed through it all, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a sense of duty, of bearing witness. This was the dark side of the dream they had been selling us. This was the consequence of believing that debt was the same as wealth. My old 4020 was parked at home in my shed, its engine cold, but its title clear. It had never made me feel rich, but on that day I understood that it had made me secure, and that was a far more precious thing. Frank's 8640 had made him feel powerful, but it was just a rental. He had been a tenant on his own farm, and the landlord had finally come to collect the rent. When the auctioneer moved on to the land, a different kind of tension filled the air. This was the heart of it all. This was the legacy. He sold off the parcels Frank had acquired during the boom years first. They went cheap to out-of-state insurance companies and investment groups, anonymous buyers who would never walk the fields or know the story of the soil. Finally, he came to the last parcel. Lot number 7, he barked, the home quarter, 160 acres with house, barn, and outbuildings. This was the original Miller farm, the piece of ground Frank's grandfather had homesteaded. It was where Frank had been born. A hush fell over the crowd. This felt different, more personal. The bidding started low. A lawyer representing the bank put in a floor bid. A well-known land speculator from Des Moines countered. They went back and forth, their voices clinical and detached, dissecting a man's heritage. I looked at Frank. He was staring at the ground, his wife holding his arm, her face buried in his shoulder. Helen squeezed my hand. "Art," she whispered. "Do something." I had never intended to buy more land. My 240 acres were enough. But this wasn't about expansion. This was about decency. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. 32,000, I said, my voice clear and steady. It was a low price, barely 200 an acre, but it was more than the speculator's last bid. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, surprised. The speculator, a man in a crisp suit, looked me over, sizing up the farmer in the worn coat. He saw my old truck, my work-worn hands. He probably figured I was at my limit. 33, he said with a smirk. He didn't know that for the last 5 years, while he and Frank were playing with bank money, I had been putting my profits, modest as they were, into savings certificates at the credit union. I wasn't borrowing to make this bid. I was spending. 40,000, I said, without hesitating. A murmur went through the crowd. The speculator's smirk faded. He conferred with a man next to him, then shook his head. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. $40,000. Going once. Going twice. His gavel came down with a crack that echoed in the cold air. Sold. To Arthur Jensen. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a profound sadness and a heavy sense of responsibility. I walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers. As I was finishing, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Frank. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face a mask of bewilderment and shame. "Art. Why?" he croaked. "To rub my nose in it? To finally prove you were right all along?" I put my pen down and looked him square in the eye. "No, Frank," I said quietly. "That's not it at all. A man shouldn't have to watch his own home be sold off to a stranger in a suit from the city. It ain't right." I took a piece of paper from my pocket, a rental agreement I'd had Helen type up the night before. "I'm not a landlord, Frank. I don't want to farm that ground. You and Carol, you stay put. You rent the house and the barns from me. The price is $1 a year. You farm the land, and we'll split the profit 50-50, just like any other sharecropper arrangement." "And Frank," I paused, making sure he was listening, "the day you can afford to buy it back, the price is exactly what I paid for it today. Not a penny more." He stared at the paper, then at me. His face crumpled. For the first time in all the years I'd known him, the proud, boastful Frank Miller broke down and wept. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't. He just nodded, a broken man, accepting a lifeline he never expected and felt he didn't deserve. The years that followed were lean, but the fever of the crisis broke. The community slowly began to heal. The talk at the diner changed. The words leverage and cash flow were replaced by equity and cost control. Men who had once mocked my old 40,020 now stopped by the shop, asking for advice on how to rebuild a water pump or set the timing on an old diesel. I never preached. I just showed them what my father had shown me, sharing the knowledge of self-sufficiency that had seen me through the storm. Being debt-free was no longer a sign of being old-fashioned. It was a badge of honor, a mark of survival. Frank and I became neighbors in a way we never had been before. The fence between our properties was still there, but the canyon between our philosophies had closed. He worked harder than I'd ever seen him work, farming his old home quarter with a fierce, quiet determination. He bought a used tractor, an old International that was even older than my John Deere, and he learned how to fix it himself. He and Carol lived simply. It took him nearly 7 years, but one day, in the early 90s, he walked up my lane with a cashier's check in his hand for $40,000. He looked older, weathered, but his eyes were clear for the first time in a decade. We shook hands, not as rivals, but as fellow survivors. One crisp autumn afternoon, a few years after that, my grandson, a boy of 10 with my same stubborn chin, was helping me in the shop. We were doing a tune-up on the 4020, getting her ready for the last of the fall field work. Her green paint was almost entirely gone in places, worn down to the primer and the bare metal by decades of work and weather. She was scarred and faded, but her engine fired on the first turn of the key. "Grandpa?" the boy asked, wiping a smudge of grease from his nose with the back of his hand. "How come we don't have a big, new tractor? Like the ones on TV, with a computer and air conditioning?" I stopped turning my wrench and looked at the old machine. I thought of Frank Miller and his 8640. I thought of the auction, the sheriff's sale, the hard-won lessons etched into the face of every farmer who had lived through the 80s. "Well, son," I said, putting my arm around his small shoulders, "there's a difference between looking rich and being rich. That big new tractor, it looks rich. It's shiny and loud, and it makes a man feel powerful. But for most folks, it comes with a big, thick book of payment coupons, and every month, a piece of that power belongs to the bank." I patted the warm hood of the 4020. "This old girl," I continued, "she might not look like much to some people. She's not the fastest or the fanciest, but she's all ours. Every bolt, every tire, every drop of oil in her belly. She doesn't have a payment book. That means when we have a good year, the money goes in our pocket, not the bank's. And when we have a bad year, like a drought or low prices, she doesn't threaten to leave us. She just waits patiently in the shed until the work starts again." I picked up the wrench and handed it to him. "This tractor doesn't represent a debt we have to pay. It represents a tool we get to use. That's real freedom. That's real wealth. Never forget that." He nodded, his young face serious, trying to grasp the weight of the lesson. Outside, the wind rustled the dry leaves in the oak trees. I turned the key, and the old John Deere diesel settled into its familiar, comforting rhythm. It wasn't the roar of ambition or the hiss of modern hydraulics. It was a simple, honest, mechanical sound. It was the sound of survival, the sound of a legacy that would endure.